Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, we'll report from the Pork Industry Day in West Point, where Alan Snodgrass updated us on PRRS in the state, and Grady Bishop from Elanco Animal Health talked about the overall state of animal agriculture. And as a March 15th deadline approaches, we'll also cover crop insurance with Rob Heyen from Crop Insurance Solutions. Our wheat marketing analyst this week is North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson. We talked with Frayne on Thursday morning after the USDA released its outlook for U.S. agricultural trade. One of the components in the report is the destination for U.S. exports. While China sits at the top, Frayne thought numbers 2 and 3 might be a surprise to some.
The report out this morning talks about all agricultural imports and exports. And when we start tracking where do we sell our agricultural products in aggregate, China is the largest destination. And again, I'm counting dollars here. So where do we sell most of our dollar volume? The number 2 and number 3 destinations, again, are a bit surprising to people. Number 2 is Canada, and number 3 is Mexico. So when we look at and compare the forecast from previous reports versus the one that came out this morning, China was relatively stable, Canada was stable, but there is expectations for increased export volume in a dollar sense into Mexico. And again, part of that is a result of the extreme dry conditions they've had in their major growing regions. So the expectation is we'll be able to sell a little bit more corn and probably some beans into Mexico.
Okay, so as you look at those 3, China, Canada, Mexico, the USDA noted that the problems were, I think, obviously going to be or could be oil shortages or stoppages, and then problems in the Eurozone. So as you look at those 3 destinations, how do those problems, or how could those problems impact those 3?
Well, obviously the world situation is very volatile right now. There's some real concerns about what's happening in the Middle East and some of the international trade implications for that. When we look at again, our major export destinations, the North Africa region and in particular parts of the Middle East become very large destinations for our winter wheat products. So we've got to understand that the classes of wheat tend to be a little bit different in their export destinations. The spring wheats tend to go into the Pacific Rim areas, and the winter wheats, in particular hard red winter wheat, goes into the North Africa and Middle East. And so the geopolitical concerns in that region are something we really need to watch, especially for the winter wheat markets. And
is there, when you talk about that, when you talk about the different classes of wheat going into where the spring is going, where the winter is going, so how does that play out here at home then, Frayne, the competition between U.S. and what we're seeing across there?
Right, and we've talked about this in the past, that the export competition and how aggressive that Black Sea region has been, in particular in Russia. And what we're seeing now is that some of that export volume is starting to drop off. And there's potentially 2 reasons for that. One is the exportable stocks out of Russia as well as Ukraine are starting to dwindle. They've already been extremely aggressive, and one of the reasons we've had some problems in the winter wheat markets is because of their aggressive sales proposals. So we are seeing some cutbacks. There's also now concerns about their major production regions, especially for winter wheat, having extremely cold temperatures, potential for winter kill, and what do we think is going to happen for their production next year? And we keep oscillating back and forth between rumors of some export bans or at least an increase in export taxes to try and slow the pace of exports out of that region versus increased or continued sales. And again, the major destinations for some of those sales out of the Black Sea region has been North Africa and parts of the Middle East. So that's putting tremendous pressure on the winter wheat complex versus spring wheats, which again tend to go more into the Asian markets.
Yeah, those export concerns there, it seems like they change from day to day. Okay, we've covered a lot of things here, but essentially as we go forward for the next month, what are you seeing? And obviously there are a lot of different structures here, but pricing, what are you seeing in pricing here at home?
Well, right now we're kind of in the winter doldrums, if you will. We're not having a huge amount of new supply information. We are going to be interested, of course, as we move forward in time to watch what happens with not only as we break dormancy here in the U.S., but more importantly, what happens in the Black Sea region and how much winter kill damage we have. Short term, the two things we'll really continue to watch very closely, of course, is the geopolitical concerns in the Middle East. And if that becomes a big concern, what's going to happen to exports and export pace? And again, the other one that is the Eurozone and the financial problems that are going on there. So right now the market is really focused on outside of agricultural issues.
For soybean farmers, good news and disappointing news from Washington this week. First, the disappointing news. In the recent payroll tax holiday extension, one of the things missing was the extension of a tax credit for blenders of biodiesel. Ben Evans, a spokesman for the National Biodiesel Board, called it a missed opportunity. There are still chances to put the credit through, but Evans says in an election year, those chances are limited. And now the good news. Thanks to a push from the federal government, bio-based products are on the rise. On Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack announced that President Barack Obama had directed him to expand the categories of those products, while the government will track and increase its purchases of those goods, such as hand soap made with soybeans. In less than 3 weeks, corn and soybean farmers will need to finalize their crop insurance plans. As you'll see in our feature with Rob Heyen from Crop Insurance Solutions, that decision for some farmers begins with one common question.
You know, a lot of times it's what's everybody else doing?
And the answer for some is waiting.
But this time of year, one of the big problems for me with crop insurance is every farmer has to make up their mind by March 15th. We don't know the final price until March 1st.
As corn and soybean prices at the elevator remain elevated, protecting them is arguably as important as ever. Even with uncertainty in final insurance prices, Heyen says farmers can still be planning ahead.
It's good if they know what their history is, what their APH or actual production history is, because that's ultimately what will determine what level of coverage they should look at, how much risk they can manage effectively with crop insurance.
For the state as a whole, that risk is high. Nebraska insured more net crop acres in 2011 than in any of the last 15 years on record. That includes covering 90% of corn and soybean acres planted. As those acres increase, so does the technology to improve yield on them. That can now be reflected in features under this year's plan.
There's a thing called a trend yield adjust, which is going to allow farmers to actually increase their APH or their average about 5 to 7%, which is really good. So in other words, if you have a 200 bushel average on an irrigated farm, you'll insure it as a 205 to 210 bushel average.
Trend yield adjustment aims in part to show current yield potential due to improved genetics and practices. Heyen says another possible benefit farmers in certain parts of the state may want to look at this year is enterprise units.
If we're able to use enterprise unit, that means I've basically thrown all my acres of one crop together within a county, and it is so much less expensive to use that type of coverage. In fact, for an example, I can buy an 80% enterprise unit policy for about the same money as a 70% optional or farm-by-farm policy.
Heyen, who also farms near Milford, says enterprise units work well for him with all non-irrigated farmland. But in mixes of irrigated and non-irrigated, the option may not necessarily be as good. Above all, there is one thing he urges farmers to consider with this year's coverage.
Hail and wind, especially wind, and production wind is just going to be crucial. And those that had it last year really benefited. Production wind just means it's like a multi-peril policy stacked on top of your federal policy. It's guaranteeing bushels, but against one or two perils, hail or hail and wind.
And as no farm or farmer is the same, Heyen says each should look at what's best for an individual situation.
Bottom line, it's all about analysis. You know, an agent must be able to look at a producer's history, understand their risk management needs, both real and perceived, and then address those needs. So it's all about analysis.
If you have questions about your crop insurance plan, remember to talk with your agent before the March 15th deadline. Both the new and old can be expected in soybean diseases for the 2012 Nebraska growing season. The February Nebraska farmer examines 6 potential disease problems this year. One is frog eye leaf spot. UNL Extension plant pathologist Lauren Giesler says it's been more common over the past few years. Management practices including resistant varieties and rotation with corn can help. Soybean cyst nematode is also a persistent pest in soybeans. It continues spreading in Nebraska, but is often overlooked by producers. You can read more about the 6 potential disease problems in the February Nebraska Farmer. In the latest issue of Supermarket News, the National Pork Board and Merck Animal Health say terminology used in meat cuts may have a bigger than expected impact. For instance, the majority of both average and heavy pork consumers believed that top loin pork chops were superior to pork loin chops or rib chops because of the word top. The National Pork Board is now conducting further studies to assess the possible changes to pork cut terminology. On Tuesday, we talked with Grady Bishop from Elanco Animal Health at the Pork Industry Day in West Point. Grady talked there about providing a safe, affordable, and abundant food supply. We started by asking about the global state of agriculture as it relates to producers here in Nebraska.
Well, I think the first thing is that the global state of agriculture is never been better in the sense that the demand for what we do right now is as high or higher than it's ever been in history. When you think about the global demand for food over the next 50 years or so, it's been stated that by 2050 we're going to have to double the amount of food that we had produced by 2010. So between 2010 and 2050, doubling the amount of food that we produce. 70% of that coming from efficiency improving technologies. So the positive aspect from agriculture is that what we do today is highly in demand and critical for the future going forward.
Now, on the other side of that, the reality is there are only so many acres that you can devote to crops or to livestock. So how do you get to that food need that you have coming?
Well, I think one example is the model that we've utilized even within the U.S. over the last 40 to 50 years. You can see pretty clearly over the last 60 years, for example, we've maintained essentially the same level of inputs, but we've increased our outputs by 150% in terms of farm productivity. So that's one of the critical pieces of it is creating a model to where we can continue to utilize technology, continue to drive efficiency to be able to meet that growing demand. There's really no other option.
What does technology mean? You mentioned technology. What does that word define?
Well, it can be defined broadly. It can be products, it can be practices, it can be genetics, all those types of things that we've learned over the years and we continue to develop that allow us to more efficiently utilize resources, that more efficiently produce protein with, whether that be in the swine industry, beef industry, any number of examples, but can be broadly stated around those kind of key areas.
How does that differ from country to country? This country and what it does for research based off of what you've seen in the past 5 years, and then what happens down in South America, say, or China. How does it differ?
Well, I had the opportunity to live and work in South America, and I think it's essentially the same. The key difference is where's your baseline, where are you starting from? So things that we've been able to employ over the last 20, 30 years, in some places they still haven't been able to employ that. I mean, the Green Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, mid parts of the 20th century, really was about taking things that we had developed around hybrids and irrigation and fertilizer, all of those things into areas where they had not utilized those types of technology. And that created a huge revolution in terms of ag productivity. I think we're at that point again where, again, there's things that we're doing in certain parts of the world where we haven't been able to introduce those that would allow us to increase productivity. That said, I think there's even more need beyond where we are today to advance in this whole area of investment around developing technologies and practices for food production.
Staying on that global scene, over the past few months, producers in this area and across the country, I'm sure, have kept a close eye on Brazil and Argentina and the drought concerns there. When we talk about increasing food, there's almost this difference between increasing food across the globe, but also making sure prices here at home stay high. So where's that battle at?
Right. I think at the end of the day, it's an economic kind of conversation around profitability and productivity and so forth. I think the positive thing, and I believe we're seeing that today, the positive thing going forward, the reason to be very bullish in terms of agriculture is this demand that's out there globally is not going to shrink. If you think about 3 billion people moving into the middle class globally, the impact that has on the types of food purchases that they want to make and that they're able to make translates directly to demand and opportunity for growth and for development of agriculture. In your beginning slide, you put up some numbers. By 2050, we're going to need 100% more food. 100%. What if we don't? What if we don't make it there? I think you're at the point where the consequences of us not innovating, not embracing technology are going to be substantial because the population increase that we have, that we've already seen because of the increase of affluence and so forth, the demand that's on the system. So, I hate to think of what that world looks like, but I'm very positive that those signals are now being sent strongly enough up and down the food chain to those people that are in a position to make decisions about choice and technology that we're going to be able to meet that challenge. I mean, that we can't approach that any other way without feeling very positive and optimistic that we're going to be able to do that.
Also at Pork Industry Day, we learned the theme for this year's National Pork Industry Forum is America's Pork Producers Building a Better Tomorrow. The forum will be held March 1st through the 3rd in Denver. At the event, delegates will hear and vote on advisements brought forth by pork-producing states. Jan Miller of the National Pork Board outlines 3 advisements that will be discussed at this year's forum.
Our advisements have to do with sustainability is one of them, and another one of our advisements that we have for the National Pork Board is to include consumer confidence when we are evaluating programs for the National Pork Board. Some of them are based off of past events, and some of them are just, a continuous change and growth in the pork industry. Everything has changed to it, and those are the things that we see that coming down the pike.
In addition to addressing sustainability and consumer confidence, the forum will also address the importance of both pork quality assurance and transport quality assurance. In 1987, a reproductive and respiratory disease in pigs emerged in the United States. At the time, it was dubbed mystery swine disease. The disease then appeared in Europe in 1990, and in 1991, investigators in the Netherlands isolated the virus and introduced the term we now know as PRRS. In West Point, veterinarian Alan Snodgrass talked with us about what the virus is and how it can affect producers in the state.
Well, PRRS virus it's an acronym for porcine respiratory and reproductive syndrome. It's a virus that affects, as it states, the reproductive system in sows and respiratory system in grow-finished pigs. It's financially very considerable cost, about $10 to $15 annually per pig produced. So financially it can be devastating to a producer, and our goal is to do what we can to control it and maybe someday eliminate it.
Is it more prevalent this year than other years?
I think every winter you certainly get that feeling, but it just is so much more viable in the winter and the fall. It likes moist environment, it likes cold. So obviously when people start talking in the winter, it sounds bad. It may be worse this year, but statistically probably not a lot different. It just gets bad every winter.
You talked earlier today here in West Point, and one of the things you said was a lot of the things you do work, a lot of the things you do don't work. So, how do you kind of base your plan off of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say everything we have works and everything we have fails more because of what we do. I think sometimes we go in with the improper expectations, whether it's vaccine or what we call serum therapy. They all work if done right, and our expectations are accurate. The vaccine's not a panacea. It's not the circovirus or pseudorabies vaccine, but it does a nice job of controlling viral shed. It does a nice job of allowing you to minimize losses, but it doesn't stop the disease. So when we fail, we probably fail with not doing things completely, and then our expectations probably aren't where they need to be either.
What are the things to do? I mean, what are some of the things you can do to narrow that percentage down?
One of the things, we have a Cumming County Area Regional Control Project going on, so we're trying to standardize what people should do. And the reality of it is we're a long way from knowing. But what I advise my clients to do is first, let's identify where it's coming from. If you're farrow to finish and it's not coming from your sow farm, that's a good thing because we can control it. If you're farrowing though, we're going to have to figure out if you're bringing it in with your piglets or if it's coming in laterally from a neighbor. So you address it differently, but the first thing you need to do is find out where it's coming from if possible and sequence it and then come up with some type of action plan to control it first with the goal of eradicating it at some point.
Right, and if it actually does come into your farm, what are the things you do then? What are the steps you go through?
First is we identify the virus, we'll get it sequenced, and then we put some type of plan together to control it. We do serum therapy frequently. That's probably the first step in a group that's never had it before. If we're farrowing, that's what we'll do. If it's a grow finish site, we'll vaccinate that site and then we'll depop it after that. It usually works itself out of there pretty well. The most difficult ones are the farrow to finish. It's tough to control in those because you have a continual source for that, continual place for that virus to hide in young piglets.
The thing I'm going to ask you now is the thing that probably a lot of people are wondering. Are we any closer to solving this? Getting a vaccine or getting a genetic that eliminates it?
One of the things we talked about today was that whatever we do, it's going to have to be a cumulative approach. So a vaccine probably isn't the end-all answer for this. It's one of the tools, and I think we're definitely getting closer to better tools, better diagnostics, better vaccines, but I think we're a long ways away from that. I think, I don't know that I can give you a timeline, but certainly we're closer, but I don't know when that answer is going to be. I think for now we need to learn to control it and to control its symptoms as much as we can. Eradication is still a long ways down the line.
Snodgrass is currently studying the characteristics and effects of PRRS at pig sites in Cumming County. And now to forecast the next 7 days, here's UNL Extension statewide climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again on Friday morning. During this last week, we've seen two systems move across the state that brought precipitation. The first one, of course, came in the Sunday through Monday time frame, ending during the early portion of Tuesday. We've seen snowfall in the area of 2 to 3 inches, very common across portions of the Panhandle and the northwestern portion of the Sandhills. As you move to the southeast of there, we had much lighter precipitation totals, and they were primarily in the form of rainfall. And basically right around the 1/10 of an inch was a very common total that we've seen across the state. The second system, more significant, moved across South Dakota through northwest Iowa, clipping northeastern Nebraska during this last 24 hours, and we've seen snowfall totals in the 6-inch plus range in a narrow band. So very welcome moisture. We need to see more of this. We've been exceptionally dry in the northeastern corner of the state, and that's part of a broader area of dryness across the northern plains, where we've seen deficits in the area of 3 to 4.5 inches since last October. So these systems are very welcome, but during this next 2 months, we expect to receive at least 5 inches of moisture in the northeast part of the state. So not only do we need to see these systems keep generating moisture, but we need to see them generate enough moisture to start cutting into those deficits we've accumulated from last fall. So we welcome the moisture. Is there more in store? Well, let's take a look at the upper air models and see whether or not the systems are going to provide that moisture to northeastern Nebraska. And the first system that moved through now drove a pretty decent trough across the central corn belt, bringing in colder air from the north. So we're looking at highs in northeastern Nebraska, primarily in the low 30s, and that's because of the snowpack just immediately to your north. As you get toward the southwest, we'll be looking at highs that will approach in the low 40s. Now, as we go to tomorrow, you're going to notice that that trough has moved rapidly to the east. We got ridging patterns developing. Probably going to be the nicest day of this next 5 or 6 days. We're looking at highs in the low 50s across the south to the low 40s across the northeast, and we might even produce some mid-50s across portions of southwest Nebraska. This trough is going to start to move into the central Rockies and start generating energy into the region, and we'll see that as we go into Sunday. The first piece of energy rapidly moves across. We shall probably see some significant snowfall, again, chances of it in South Dakota and southern Minnesota. Northern Nebraska looks to be on the southern periphery of this system, so we're probably looking at 1 to 2 inches possibly of snowfall. Further south, it primarily will be sprinkles, nothing more than that. Highs low 30s across the northwest and north central part of the state. As you get to southeast Nebraska, low 40s. Now, as we get into Monday, we're going to see that that trough remains in place, and another piece of energy tries to shoot out. Will generate some light rainfall across southern Nebraska. Less than a 1/10 of an inch is likely. We're looking at highs in the low 30s across the north to the low 40s across the south. By the time we get to Tuesday, that system is still in place, so another piece of energy may eject out on Tuesday, give us a chance for scattered light precipitation across southern Nebraska, looking at highs in the low 30s north, low 40s south. The real emphasis of this forecast would be Wednesday as the system moves out. We could generate some accumulating snowfall, and we have to pay attention because we could actually see enough snowfall to generate advisories or even a winter storm watch. We'll be looking at highs in the low 30s across the northeast to the mid 40s across the south or the west. And as we go into Thursday, that system moves through. We're kind of in a zonal flow with the cold to our north and the warm to our south. So we'll be looking at highs in the low 30s north to the low 50s across the south. 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday keeps the warmth to our east, the cold to our west. And in terms of precipitation, we're looking at wet to our west, wet to our east, and we're pretty much stuck in the middle with normal types of precipitation.
Thanks, Alan. As we close out the show, we take a look at this week's Market Journal Twitter feed. The Drovers Cattle Network reports that recent rains have helped green up the landscape in Texas, but hay and grazing areas are still in short supply. Most livestock producers in the state still need to provide supplemental hay and feed. The High Plains Journal says the Beef Checkoff is celebrating 25 years of programs. The program was part of the 1985 Farm Bill and began on October 1st, 1986. The Beef Checkoff is designed to encourage research, promotion, and education. We'll have more on the Checkoff next week on Market Journal. In another tweet from the High Plains Journal, ag exports reached $136.3 billion in the 2011 calendar year. On Monday, McDonald's announced it would ask pork suppliers for a plan to phase out the use of sow gestation stalls. Beef Magazine reacts to this story and says the trade-offs to the loss of gestation stalls are more sow injuries, higher feed costs, and likely more injuries to workers. As always, Market Journal is available on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can also find more information on our website at marketjournal.unl.edu. Next week, we'll report from the triumph of Ag Expo at the CenturyLink Center in Omaha. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their Checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.